can do it that way. There we go. I think that'll work. All right, Kat. Let me see if I can help you out here. Oh, fuck, I forgot to go get the... Damn it. Oh, man, I forgot to get those. What's up? How's it going? I'll tell you what. I try not to get frustrated sometimes, but every once in a while, somebody gets under my skin. It's painful sometimes to... ignorance is a very dangerous thing. And, I should be more chill about it because all of us come from a point at some point where we didn't know something or weren't aware of something. And but I just experienced an interaction with a guy who's just... I don't know if he's being genuine. If he is being genuine, I just feel really sorry for the guy. But welcome, everybody. Thank you for the follow, whoever followed me. Appreciate it. Nice flag, by the way, next to your name. Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday, day, night, wherever you may be. I just finished taking the dog out for a bit of a walk. The last time I was on was Sunday. I've been going on a lot of other people's lives, as I like to do, but, sometimes you just have to do your own thing just to get enough time to speak to some things. Some of the panels get quite busy. But I have some interesting things to share. Again, these are controversial subjects. I really wish, sincerely, that most of the things that I talk about, I didn't have to talk about, that they didn't exist, that they weren't the way they were, because the world would be a better place if these things weren't part of it. But alas, I think to not talk about these things, to kind of cower in silence, is the worst characteristic of a human being. What's worse than it happens is you die, which is going to happen to every one of us, no matter at some point. So, you can live on your knees, you can live in fear, you can cower, you can be afraid of everybody, calling you names, or you can speak out. And, I think we have an obligation when we learn certain things to speak out. You can do it in ways that are constructive, and you don't have to be mean-spirited about it or hateful in speaking out, but you should speak clearly and directly to the problems that are. And, I think one of the things we're going to have to do, unfortunately, and we're seeing so many manifestations of these problems now, it's kind of gone on steroids, like the gas pedal's being hit at a much higher rate. And there's just a lot of things that are challenging. Somebody here says lagging. I don't know if that's for you. I have it on my Wi-Fi in my place, so it should be good. Glam, if you have something constructive to say about the conversation, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you a 5-minute pause. If you want to come back and talk after that, we can talk. Yeah, actually, I just took you out for the whole thing. Listen, the name calling, again, if you have something good to say about the conversation that's substantive and on point with the issues, I welcome it, even if it completely disagrees. It's frustrating sometimes when you have such broad gaps between beliefs, but that's okay. That's part of polite dialogue. But when you start doing the name calling and the smearing, I saved a video for you all to watch tonight. It has a Knesset member, former Knesset member. She's a relative, probably a woman in her 50s or something like that. She's Israeli. And she was doing an interview with Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman in New York. And she said, it's a trick that we use. When someone from Europe criticizes Israel, we bring up the Holocaust. And when someone from America criticizes Israel, we call them an anti-Semite, which is what somebody just called me in the chat. And this is so pathetic. Because if the same characteristics were coming and influencing our country and even other places around the world, and it was a different group of people, I would point to that group and say, hey, this particular group is causing A, B, and C to occur. This is the undue influence coming from that group. Let's say they happen to be Ethiopian. That's what I would say. Hey, isn't it interesting that the Ethiopian population globally is, 14, 15 million people, and yet they have, 45, 60% of the positions of power in the United States, 35% in England, among ownership of businesses and banking systems. It would just be what it is. But for some reason, when you point to another group with a different name, all of a sudden you're a bad guy. So it just is what it is, right? And so the point I try to bring up is if you don't want to have people point these things out, don't do them. If you don't want people to criticize Israel specifically as far as what's going on in its response to the October 7th attacks, don't do those things at that scale, and people will be less likely to criticize you. Don't talk an American president into agreeing to take over territory that it has no business even coming up with the concept of taking over that territory, much less actually leaning into it and trying to do it. And I don't think it's all going to happen, by the way, but I guess it could. But just by the fact that America, we're not Israel, okay? Our country is a separate, and I know it doesn't seem like it sometimes, but America is a separate nation state with its own interests, and it's supposed to provide for the interest of its own people. Now that is a whole other conversation where that gets out of whack. But specifically with this special relationship between the Americans and Israel, it's unhealthy. And I don't know if you saw this. I couldn't believe I saw this. So when President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were getting ready to sit down at a meeting table, and they were going to be seated next to each other, President Trump pulled the chair out like you would do for a dinner date, pulled the chair out for Prime Minister Netanyahu. He sat in it, and then he kind of moved it forward like a gentleman would do, bringing his his date to a dinner. And Nick Fuentes was joking about it. He's like, we should be wearing like maybe a butler coat or something like that, asking him if he can bring him a glass of wine or something like this. This is just how insidious this is. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what led to this? Because it's a very unusual relationship, and the way in which this is all going down is very strange, by the way. It's almost insidiously over the top. The fact that the U.S. has sort of agreed to do all of these things, money, power, maybe even sending in American troops to carry out a horrendous policy of forcibly expelling people from their land, that's disgusting in and of itself. But it's even worse when you have a situation where the leader, and we don't know why this is happening, right? It could be that President Trump just loves Israel, right? That he just has an affinity, a place for his heart in his heart for the country. But it could be other things too. It could be that he got caught up in that person's flights to islands, initials JE. It could be that. It could be other compromising things like that. It could be, and I thought about this earlier today, when Donald Trump, before he got involved in politics, he went through some very significant financial difficulties. At one point, because of some bankruptcies, his entire business enterprise was at risk of failure. He got himself over his head on some real estate purchases where he overpaid for some real estate. His casinos were failing, and he needed help. So everyone at the time, and what was alleged by the Clinton administration, was that he got that help from Russia. That it was like rich, wealthy oligarchs from Russia who had given him money, and therefore he was somehow compromised towards Russia. That was the Democratic argument at the time. There was the Steele dossier, all the allegations by Hillary Clinton, it goes on and on. And they tried to impeach him for it, which, again, I just want there to be the truth. Whatever the truth is, it's the truth. But it turned out that was total garbage. So then the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, when he went through that difficulty, we know that American banks didn't do it. So who did? Is it possible that there were people who approached Donald Trump in his moment of need and said, hey, I'm willing to give you a hand, but at some point, may I please, like in The Godfather, hopefully at some point in the future, I can call on you for a kindness. In other words, a quid pro quo. I'll bail your ass out, but you got to do some shit for me. That could be the case too. I don't have anything in writing to prove any of this, but I'm just throwing out possibilities against the wall. But it does seem unusual, given how distant the situation is versus what affects average Americans. It doesn't affect the average American, what happens in Gaza or the West Bank. Not that we shouldn't care, but it doesn't directly impact the lives, bad or good, to the average American citizen. So then the question would be, well, if it doesn't have a direct influence on the American citizenry, why is it getting so much attention? Why does this one nation state get such special privilege and have so much money and power and influence connected with it? It just seems odd. This is what Professor John Mearsheimer spoke to in his book, The Israel Lobby. And I invite everybody to read that book. And it is an uncanny, unusual relationship. But let's just dissect this for a second. So to get this straight, so we know that there was the attacks of October the 7th. Israel very angrily committed to respond overwhelmingly. They said things like, we're going to cut off no food, no fuel, no electricity. We're dealing with human animals. We're going to act accordingly. President Isaac Herzog said there are no innocent people in Gaza. People on Israeli television publicly called for every member of H group or male prisoners to have things shoved up their backside. That the only thing wrong right now is it's not happening to everybody. This is the kind of language we heard. I mean, this is a sentiment of a sick society. And then what do we see happen after that? So they respond, and in the process of their response, they claim they had two objectives. One was to go after the H group. That makes sense. and the other one was to get their hostages back. That makes sense. But what did they actually do? Well, they claimed they were doing those things, but what they actually did was they carried out a campaign of revenge, which involved indiscriminate and massive destruction of infrastructure and the associated loss of life, where they sort of recklessly at best, purposely at worst, targeted the population. And obviously, yes, they have the capability to do far more of it. They could have done worse, but what they did was pretty bad. And the only thing, if you're someone who's listening on the pro-Israeli side of this, and you're like, well, how dare you tell us how to do this? All I want to point you to is, if you were in a conflict with Iran, which may happen, and they were able to do those things to you, would you want them to justify carrying out their war against your state using those tactics? Would you want to have an Iranian aircraft travel into Israel's airspace, fire a missile at the base of a 14-story residential building because an AI targeting system said that there were 2 IDF commanders or mid-level officers that lived in the building and they might be there, not that they were there, they might be there. And so they take the whole building down and 136 Israeli civilians lose their life in the process. No warning, no advance notice, just kaboom. And this happened thousands and thousands of times. Now, if the Iranians were doing that to the Israelis, as much as I don't like the Israeli state and how it behaves, I don't want to see Israeli civilians get harmed in that way. I would call out that action as being crazy. How dare you say you're going to justify going after a couple of soldiers or militants and bring down 135 civilians? Like, are you crazy? Have you lost your goddamn mind? And this happened thousands of times, over and over again. And the country that I live in, very sadly, supplied the goddamn weapons that were used in this inappropriate tactic. Politicians, some of whom signed, and celebrities, signed their signature with a Sharpie on the very munitions that were going to be used to carry out these policies. I mean, that to me is just disgusting. I just don't understand how anybody can support this. So it's all about keeping the same consistent standard. Now, what have we heard since? Well, after this massive campaign, 15 months of death and destruction and starvation and cruelty, barbarism across the board, what happened? Were they able to vanquish the enemy? Nope. They claim they've unalived 18 to 20,000 fighters, but those numbers seem inflated. They've underestimated the number of people that they've lost or been injured, I believe. Many of us agree. And they're downplaying everything to their advantage. Now, here's the thing. Some of the hostages have come home. That's a good thing. Some of the Palestinian prisoners or detainees, or in some cases, if they're overcharged or if they're picked up and held under administrative detention, many of us would call them political prisoners or hostages as well. Many of them have returned as well, as they should. So if you're opposed to that, again, you have to give something to get something. And finally, Israel was forced to come to the bargaining table in order to get some of their hostages back. Now, it's still in progress. Hopefully things play out smoothly, and everybody who is healthy and can come home does. That's the right thing to wish for. I don't know, by the way, how these latest edicts from the United States may play into that. I mean, think about it from this way. Even though you want to get your prisoners back, the number one thing you hold as a leverage point over your adversaries, we have your people. In fact, we've heard recently, I'm sure you've heard this name, the Bibas family. And I'm not going to be disrespectful. I mean, I feel terrible that a mother and children ended up getting caught up in all this madness. I don't want that to be the case. But we did hear that the husband was released recently. He was one of the first few groups of hostages as a part of this first phase. But the mother, supposedly the mother, and this is what the H group has said publicly to the Israelis, that the mother and the 2 children, the very young child and the 5 or 6 year old child, they lost their life in an Israeli airstrike. Okay, they would like to have returned them healthy and happy, right? That's what everybody wants to do. They want to get their people back and return the others. That's the whole idea the mission took place in the first place. It wasn't to go in and just recklessly wreak havoc on the Israeli population. It was to take hostages. Look. There are videos and there are also written statements as to why the H group carried out what they called the Al-Aqsa flood mission. And if you're somebody who wants to say, well, all they did was ruthlessly slaughter civilians. No, they didn't. Unfortunately, that was part of it. But what they did was they went in and conducted a very, very surprise and effective and relatively large for the situation, military operation, very precise military operation that engaged military outposts, engaged soldiers and uniformed police, 374 of which made up the numbers that came from that day. 1,167 people was the final count after all the burnt remains were sorted out DNA testing at the Nova Festival, many of whom may have lost their lives at the hands of the Israeli response. There's also people in the kibbutzim that probably lost their lives at the hands of Israeli tank fire or artillery that was used to try to stop and prevent the taking of families hostage, or situations where there were people held captive within a home. The Israelis employed, which is what everybody agrees on, and it's been alluded to by the Israelis, the Hannibal Directive. So if you're somebody who's pro-Israel, it's not as simple as like H group all bad, H group did all these bad things, whatever happens next is the fault of the Palestinians. I'll direct your attention to this fact. Yes, in 2006, 74% of the broader Palestinian electorate voted for Hamas to come into power. That's indisputable. That's record. Now, the U.S. did not want them to take power, so it contacted the Palestinian Authority and said, we have our support to prevent them from taking power. There was a violent interaction, and of course they took over Gaza, but they weren't able to take over power in the West Bank. I would argue that there was a coup d'etat that took place with the West's support to maintain power, just like the Democrats were accusing the rioters on, the date after the 5th of January in 2020, when they didn't want to allow one person to certify the election, right? They called that an attempted insurrection, for Christ's sakes. So what do you call what happened when the Palestinian Authority, who lost the honest democratic election, the West supports them maintaining power illegitimately? Okay? So this is standard U.S. practice, as someone said in the comments. But getting back to the point of the current policy, I just had an interaction with somebody on another live, and this was an American, and to say that this person was naive beyond belief is the understatement of the century. And I don't like to criticize people. I'm not saying it to be critical of him, just the way that he believes the U.S. functions versus what actually goes on. They couldn't be further apart. And he made the argument, which is unfortunately held by far too many Americans, I think less since October the 7th, but still far too many, is they have a belief, a faith in the system, both electorally and in terms of our nation state, as far as how we use our power and influence around the world. And to what end? Freedom, democracy, Pledge of Allegiance, all that nonsense, which once you start to look behind the curtain and you see the Wizard of Oz, you start to get the real picture. And again, these are harsh truths that I would rather not acknowledge. I would be much happier if the things I had learned pulling that curtain back were much more positive than negative, but they are what they are. Now, thank goodness we have a freedom of speech in this country, at least for now. We'll see how it plays out in the near future. But we can speak to these things as long as we don't say, too inflammatory things or wish certain things to change in certain ways that are not appropriate. We can speak to it, and we should. But if you look at what the United States has proposed to do right now, it is absurd. Think about it for a second. There's a conflict going on between one state and an adjacent group of people that don't have nation statehood. Okay, their military obviously did a great job physically repelling the invasion of the adversary. The adversary had air superiority. There were no ground-to-air missiles to defend the aircraft, so they pretty much had total control over the skies and could do whatever they wanted from above. They also had military superiority on the ground in terms of the equipment, the stuff they have as far as tanks and personnel carriers and weaponry and resupply and all the best helicopters to evacuate people that got hurt and all of that. And with all of that stuff, all that modern equipment, all of the benefits they had, they couldn't overcome their adversary. So what does that tell you? It tells me a couple of things. One, the reason why they weren't able to overcome them is not because they're a bad military per se. I mean, I argue they could be a lot better if they didn't have as many reservists involved, but that's a different conversation. But it tells you that an army, a military force, militants that fight with the advantage of territorial control, knowledge of their own terrain, the urban environment, which is very difficult to fight in, as well as the tunnel system, it gives them a key advantage over their adversary that's hard to overcome. So at the best of hopes, Israel came in and did what they could, and they used the tools they did have effectively They dropped a bunch of boom booms. They destroyed a bunch of infrastructure. As they went through different parts of the territory, they laid explosives and destroyed things like schools, hospitals, mosques, residential areas. You name it. If it was there and they had the time to do it and they could do it, they blew it the fuck up. Okay. In addition, because of how reckless and over the top this was, they ended up moving the population in many cases and then booming them as they were headed places, or where they went, they boomed them, claiming every time there must be a militant here, so we had the right to do it. Same old story we always hear. It's always justified. There's always a T-risk involved, blah, blah, blah. And what happened? Right now we're at 61,000 or so. That's probably way low versus what actually happened. President Trump, when he talked about this operation of moving people out, he said 1.7, 1.8 million. So what about the other 300,000 people that would make us, to get to 2.1, which is where the population was before this started? That's somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people that aren't accounted for. Right now, there's 61,000 that the H Group Health Ministry has reported as confirmed unalived from specific conflict-related death. Okay? But that leaves a huge gap. So we won't know what the numbers are for some time, obviously. It could be lower, it could be higher. But whatever it is, it's insane. And again, I just want you to have some perspective. If you're somebody who's pro-Israeli, just think for a second. What, in your worst nightmare, what if this were happening to your population? Just imagine for a second that 61,000 mostly Jewish Israeli citizens had lost their life at the hands of an adversary because they had superiority from above and they chose to execute the campaign the way that Israel has. And they were able to destroy buildings and infrastructure and places of worship and universities and everything else that went with it. And people are under rubble still. They're rotting corpses. And you don't even have the equipment to move the physical concrete off the piles to get to the dead people. Imagine that. Just imagine, listen, I know it's not the same because of the military asymmetry, but just imagine for a second what it must be like to undergo that. Just imagine the impact psychologically, just in and of itself, not just the horrible nature of the situation, like it's unthinkable, but just imagine the psychological damage if everyone else in your whole family died at the hands of how angered would you be, and how just totally just beside yourself. And I can't imagine going through that. And so this is why it's so difficult to get your head around this. So we have a group of people, and people from this group have spoken directly to this issue I'm about to raise, and good for them for doing so. But when your people, 2 generations ago, at the hands of a maniacal regime, try to work your people to death, send them off the camp, steal their property, in some cases just unalive them for no reason, at large numbers, and the colloquial statement in the public domain is never again, like nothing of this disgusting nature should ever happen again. It should be for everybody. Nothing this dastardly should occur, regardless of what precedes it, especially when it's this vastly disproportionate. Nothing should spur this type of thing on, and yet it has. And somehow, some way, something got lost in translation from generation to generation. The values of the trauma that the people experienced got lost. And I was on a live today, and they were talking about taking out all the people of Gaza and all these other cavalier statements about the civilian population. And I said in the comments, I said, you all have completely lost your sense of compassion and humanity. And that's what I'm referring to. And yes, they have every right to be angry about what happened on October the 7th. Because it was bad. But it doesn't justify the response that has been vastly disproportionate, inappropriate, and fueled and funded and backed up politically by the United States, which I regret deeply. That the country that I grew up in is providing political cover, economic framework, and military supply for one of the most devastating chapters in modern history. I just think it's shameful. And now with this latest edict, and let's face it, this is what this was. This was an edict. This wasn't a negotiation behind closed doors. The new administration has come in. They've decided to pledge whatever additional allegiances to this unusually close ally of the United States, Israel, and agree to do something so over the top, it's unthinkable. And that is tell, not ask nicely, tell the adjacent nation states, Egypt and Jordan, you will take up to 1 million people each from this territory because we say so. because we believe the best way to go about this is to move the people out and clear the territory and do some sort of redevelopment at whatever pace and time frame we decide, because we don't want the people to have to suffer living in unlivable conditions. Well, first of all, why not ask the people? They're the ones who have to deal with it. So if they choose to stay, regardless of the challenges of being there while the reconstruction occurs, obviously that's their choice, right? Why would you decide for them that because it's going to be difficult that you shouldn't stay there? That's their choice, not yours. And obviously what it leads you to think about at that point then, well, if they're just assuming that they want the people to leave, well, then why is that assumption being made? And then you can carry it to the next step. Well, maybe, just maybe, they don't want the people there, right? Just maybe. And I think anyone with a lick of sense over the age of 6 or 7 can see that for what it is. Now, is it going to be practical to implement that? I can't imagine it happening. We've already heard specifically the rejection of this plan from all the adjacent leaders. As much as they depend on and are co-opted by the West, we know that it's impractical for them politically within their own country and within the greater Arab world, quote unquote, for them to say yes to this. It's a political suicide for them to betray an issue that's been so important to the mindset of most of the population for decades, and then to turn on that and collude with the United States to basically to extinguish the territory of people, giving the Israelis an easy out to ethnically cleanse at the hands of the Americans. That to me is just, it's just beyond. And I brought this up with a guy earlier today, and again, let's think ahead for this. I don't think it's going to happen, but let's just say it does. Let's say there's a sincere effort to move forward and do this with whatever it takes, regardless of what the cost is. And the question would be, why should American soldiers, male or female, young people, maybe be put into a situation where they have to face the adversary of this other country because they're too chicken shit, excuse my language, to risk their own soldiers, or maybe they do a joint venture of some type. But why should an American soldier die or get injured, blown up, whatever, because they're going in and trying to remove a foreign people from their lands that doesn't have anything to do with our country? Why should we get involved in that? We have no place getting involved in that. Listen, it's one thing to wish somebody well, give them some money, give them some supplies, and say, okay, if you want to fight it, good luck. We're helping you. But to commit U.S. resources at that level, if that's the direction it took, I asked this guy earlier today. He said he is an American. He's in his 40s. He said his brother served and lost his life. I didn't get into details. And I said to him, would you be willing right now, would you personally be willing to lay down your life in order for this to happen? Is that the level of commitment you feel to this policy? And he came up with this ridiculous answer like, well, I trust my leadership and I trust the chain of command. And so if the president, who's duly elected by the people, makes this decision, then I guess that's just what has to happen. We have to lose these people. And I'm thinking to myself, do you have any ability to do any critical thought when it comes to this? Are you just going to accept hook, line, and sinker, the dogma that gets thrown in your face about whatever we do has to be good because we're the USA, as he said, the greatest country that's ever been? This is the sort of programming and indoctrination that people on different sides of this have. I think the experience of the people who are pro-Israeli, they don't realize it because you can't see what you can't see about yourself sometimes. It's like you can't even see it. It's like a blind spot. And a lot of Americans, unfortunately, share this when it comes to how they view the American experience. And I don't want people to have a negative view of our country, but I want them to have a realistic appraisal of the things that are actually done in our name that have negative impacts on others, and in many cases don't benefit the broad swath of the nation, of the people. A lot of these actions are done in the name of a very small group of other strategic interests that tend to benefit the ownership class, whether it's access to strategic resources, military bases, whatever it may be, for further control of shipping lanes and resources around the world. We're seeing this right now with Greenland. That's another great example. How can it be morally argued that the United States government has the right to proclaim to Denmark, who has had sort of autonomy over Greenland, but there's a separate population there, that we have to take it because it's in our strategic interest, economically and militarily, going ahead? I mean, how can you listen to this shit? It's like, what? What? So, I mean, these are the things that I find, and I guess the best word to use is highly troubling. And it's this arrogance and this indifference to the negative impacts that arrogance has on others, this sort of cavalier decision that because I want it to be so, it's going to be so. That's what I find problematic. It's the mindset. And it's the same thing with political Zionism. It's this belief of entitlement and, dare I say, amongst many, supremacy, where they feel like they have every right to take something, that the other people were stubborn and out of their minds for not accepting this generous offer of less than half the territory when they made up more than 2/3 of the population, 90% 3 decades earlier. That's presumptive and arrogant in my view. So getting back to the deal, just think it through for a second. What are the logistical requirements to accomplish this? Well, we know that the Israeli military, with all of their power and all of their bombardment and all of the destruction and all of the death, what were they capable? They were able to kill civilians. They killed, tens of thousands of children. What kind of shit is that? How can you justify that? So, assuming that if that plan didn't work, what's going to be required to work? Well, maybe you increase the bombardment. Maybe you try to further corral people out. Maybe you do things that are unthinkable. But it's going to involve a ton of civilian casualties, because what happened so far didn't work to get the militants, and it killed 60,000 plus people. So what do you think is going to happen if a more intense chapter follows? And if it does involve ground troops having to come in and fight inside the tunnels, maybe they use drones or robotics as a starting point, but eventually you got to get in there and fight. You're not going to be able to remove the H group without major, major, major conflict. And these, by the way, I'm not saying I support anybody or don't support. I'm saying that they're very resolved fighters. They obviously aren't afraid to die, unlike most Americans and most Israelis who are. It doesn't mean people don't love life. It just means people have a fear that's greater than their desire to go after the enemy. Whereas other people have a desire they're willing to lose their life in pursuit of something that's bigger than themselves. Most enlisted Americans and most enlisted Israelis are thinking about their own ass first. And I don't blame them for that. They should. But, is this for the survival of Israel? No, there's no way the H group has any chance to go in, like people say on October, it was genocidal intent. That's bullshit. They couldn't go in and do a fraction of the damage to the broader Israeli society, even if they wanted to. They don't have the equipment or the manpower. But the Israelis do. But they with all of those benefits, they weren't able to accomplish even a fraction of their goals. And so what is it going to require to achieve those goals? It's going to require a very excessive acts of violence. And I just don't see it happening. I mean, if you don't have any nations that will even take the people, where are you going to put them? There's nowhere to put them. If the adjacent countries won't allow them out, you're going to have to, you're going to go to war with Egypt to force them to back off their borders, to make them physically create space for people to go? Are you going to go to war with Jordan? Are you going to try to military eliminate everybody, just pound everybody into submission because this is your plan? I just don't see, it's just not practical. And it's so diplomatically impractical. I mean, think for a second if you were the Jordanian leader. No one came to you ahead of time and tried to talk this through or work it out. And then you hear in a news conference when the Israeli leader comes to America and they stand up and they basically, what to his what, kiss his rear end. And then you hear this announcement saying, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. I mean, can you imagine what would go through the head of the leader when this is first being said? I mean, I'd be like, who in the fly, I'm sure this is just normal human reaction. Who in the F are you to make this proclamation that I'm just going to do what you say? You haven't even had the courtesy to consult me about it first, right? I just find it so presumptive. So I think it's impractical. I think it's obviously contravenes international law in the biggest, baddest way. And by the way, taking that land and stealing it from somebody, ethnically cleansing them, you might want to get away with that shot in 1840. Right, before the modern world has formed around this with international institutions, social media. But I don't think people are going to stand for this shit. And it also is going to put the leaders of these countries under very difficult situations if they decide to comply with this. So, I don't know. The whole thing seems really, really just sketchy to me. Now, I want to shift gears a second and talk about something else, because we can talk about that forever, and I think I've kind of exhausted that topic. But this is something else that's really important. Now, we've talked about what's going on with the political system, why all these things are allowed to happen. I mean, this bozo that I was speaking to, not to be mean about it, but he was so ignorant of some of the realities politically in the United States. We know that money drastically influences politics. Let's face it, we basically have a system of legalized bribery, right? You can throw a bunch of money into a big pot called a political action committee. They're not supposed to coordinate with the parties or the candidates, but in essence, they just go out and buy a bunch of ads, which they may as well coordinate, and all the other costs of the campaigns. And everybody dumps money into these different buckets that end up supporting somebody. And we get basically two choices as Americans. We have the Democratic choice and we have the Republican choice. But here's a fair question. What if the financial interested parties, whether they be from industry groups, whether they be from foreign countries like AIPAC and Christians United for Israel and all this other stuff, what if these groups have enough money to spread around so that no matter who you vote for, the policies that they vote for and enact once they become elected are the same? So it doesn't really matter whether you go with A or B. So the person's argument was, this guy that I talked to, this guy named Farrow, he said, well, hey, in 4 years, we have a chance to change all this because we can just vote somebody else in. If you don't like President Trump, vote for, but you're missing the point. The people are smart enough. It's beyond, it's such low level intelligence to understand this. But if you're somebody who wants to make sure that whatever your interests are served politically, then obviously you just have to figure out who's going to make it to the stage. Make sure, and you just, like they say, if there was a third-party candidate, they just write a third check, right? It's become so comical, it's beyond absurd at this point. It's like a bad movie. It's like a nightmare, and it's totally out of control. And in my view, and I've talked about this a lot for those of you who are new, I think it's irreparably broken. I don't think no matter what we try to do at the voting booth that any of these entrenched problems can change. I mean, just to be clear, Citizens United, which is the court case that the Supreme Court adjudicated, has now made it legal to use money as speech. So if you're a high net worth individual or if you're a corporation, there's a limit to how much money you can directly give a candidate, but you can give unlimited amounts of money to any of these third-party political action committees, these super PACs. And imagine if you're somebody trying to compete with that. Like, let's say I ran for, or one of us ran for Congress. We can't compete with $100 million, $500 million, $1 billion. Nobody has that kind of money. Even if everybody chipped in from the entire country, they can't compete with that. But the corporations and these other people that raise a lot of money from the wealthiest people on earth, they can. And they do. And that's why things are where they are. So if somebody says corporations are people, they're considered that way under the law, but they're not human beings, obviously. So this is the problem. And there are only two ways to fix Citizens United if you want to reverse that. And by the way, just reversing that alone wouldn't change the corruption that existed prior to. This just put it on steroids. But if you're going to work your way from where we are backwards, you'd have to have a constitutional amendment. And the way that gets enacted, for those who aren't knowledgeable about the U.S. Constitution, you have to either get a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate and then signature by the president, or you have to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to vote in favor of it. And again, if somebody who's smart, knowing this, can throw enough money around to make sure that the first thing can't happen, and then go to the state houses and play the same game at the local level, now you have an impenetrable barrier for political change on an issue that's self-reinforcing. It's like a self-reinforcing feedback. More money gets spent, it makes it even more impossible to break through those 2 points that are barriers. That's kind of where I think we find ourselves. And there are a lot of people that talk about this. I'm not alone in identifying this. And it's a problem. It's a big, big, big problem. Now, you add in the chilling effect of certain interest groups that have tremendous power over and above the baseline of what I just laid out. And this involves groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And the way that they do business is even worse. Most groups do this quietly, sort of behind the scenes. They'll donate some money. They try to keep it off the radar. They don't want people to know they're sticking their hand in this process because they just want to get their way. And they don't want to bring a lot of negative attention. But what the Israelis do is they pretty much throw it in your face. They'll say, oh, we gave $100 million this cycle for these 7 candidates to win, and all of them won. And they'll brag about it. You go to their website, they'll say 95% of the candidates that we backed make it into office. It's like, what? So even my new congressman who came in after the congressman that had been in my district just retired, I tried to call after this announcement happened this is, by the way, as citizens, this is what we're supposed to do to be a good citizen. You vote, and then if an issue comes up, you call your representative, right? Express your views, make your voice heard. So I did that because I figured I got to at least try that, right? That's what they're telling me we're supposed to do to try to get some change. So I called, I talked to a junior staffer. And I said, hey, I don't know how much you know about this issue, but President Trump just said publicly that the United States is going to go into Gaza, this little strip of land that's next to Israel, and take it over and own it and push the population out, at least publicly, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently, to clean it up and then develop it to make it a better place to live for people in the region to enjoy, is what he said. He didn't say who's coming back, whatever. It was left very ambiguous. And the staffer had no clue, had no idea this was even going on. And I said, I just want you to let you know, as a constituent who lives in the district of this congressman, I'm against it. I'm totally opposed to that. I think that's way over the top, out of pocket. We shouldn't do it. It's a huge expenditure, potential loss of soldiers. You know, the same thing I talked about here. And he said, okay, I'll pass it on to the representative, is what he said. And I said, has anybody else contacted you about this? He's like, nope, you're the only one. So I'm one person out of the entire district, which has about 85,000 residents. And I'm the only person out of 85,000 Americans from this one district that contacted the office just to make mention of it. Which, by the way, when this message gets passed along, how much emphasis and how much attention do you think it's going to get from the congressman? I mean, if 0 is your answer, you're probably overestimating. So herein lies the problem. The will of the constituency just doesn't have a chance to make it into the political arena. And this is exactly the way the powers that be would like to keep it. I mean, why wouldn't you? Right? It makes sense. So I then went and looked at, because I know this is a person who used to serve at another level when I grew up in a different location. He was a county executive, which is like the head of the county. And so I went to check his political stance on the Israel issue. And it turns out, well, as Eric Warsaw would say, a lot of blueberry involved in the whole intertwining. And his views are Israel has a right to defend itself. We need to provide unlimited support to Israel. I'm thinking to myself, you know, Jesus Christ, is every single person under the spell of this particular issue the same way? I mean, how many people can even take a different view, even if they felt it personally? And the answer is few, if any. One of the lives I was just on, someone else named AJ read a statement by Senator Sanders, who, by the way, is an adamant supporter of Israel and takes a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry, even though he rails against them. He said, it's just impossible in our country to stand up against the Israel lobby, because if you say anything publicly critical of Israel, you're done. They're going to throw enough money to get you primaried. You're gone. It's basically political suicide. And that is a huge problem. And right now, there is no policy possibilities that will ever change this issue in the near future. I mean, I guess if we're lucky, really lucky, some of the Gen Z who are in their late teens, early 20s, maybe as late as 25 or 30, they're potentially the pool from which the new leadership will be drawn. And because they are now seeing what's happening in 4K on their phones, they're kind of, they're just shocked by what Israel's chosen to do. They probably have a different, more nuanced view on the issue. So when someone comes in with money, they're going to have to think it through. Well, do I go with what I know, or do I just play ball? And it may be they have to play ball if the circumstances don't change with that. But at least they'll have some knowledge that others don't have. And it might change the policy. Probably won't. So the question is, as Americans, and I've been talking to a lot of people about this lately, and it's a very touchy subject, and there are a lot of problems associated with it, and a lot of big issues that I certainly don't want to get involved in. I wish none of this was even had to be talked about. I wish it was just smooth sailing, but unfortunately it isn't. We're basically in the midst of what I believe to be basically like a war. There's a war where one small group of people in our country, the wealthy class, certain interest groups, and a lot of the permanent establishment, those who are in intelligence and security and militarism, that whole intertwined mess that people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange exposed, they're real. And they have different objectives that don't necessarily serve the electorate. They have other interests that supersede what should happen in my view, should happen for the majority of constituents. I shouldn't have to make a phone call and have my message die on the vine. We should have some impact. But we're an afterthought. So the question is that this is a war that's been waged proactively since the Reagan administration in the United States, and even before, but really took footing in 1980. And it was an effort to reduce the power of labor unions, to reduce costs for corporations, to limit regulation, and to expand the projection of American power globally through commerce and militarism. And this is what's been happening. It just is what it is. right? Russia's been on the receiving end of it. China's been pushed around a bit. Other countries, obviously, coup d'etats, the whole nine yards. You can look it up on Google, type in regime change operations. It is what it is. So the question is, has that thing, I call it the Leviathan, the scary monster, it's morphed into this sort of machine that has its own life politically with the corruption, the money in politics, the embedded militarism, surveillance state, and all the stuff that's coming with that. There's a guy I want to talk about. Remember, in a second, I'll get to Alex Karp of Palantir, and playing a big role in how this is all shaping up. But the bottom line is, folks, if you're somebody who lives in America, obviously you're getting crushed by inflation, as most of us are feeling that. You go to the store and you're like, holy shit, I used to spend $100 on groceries, now it's $1.60 or $1.80. That's a different world to live in, right? Everything costs more. Insurance costs more. Cars cost more. Rates are high. Everything's tough. If you're a young person, you can't even buy a house, can't buy a car. Maybe you have to live with your parents. Maybe you have to roommate with 7 other people in a one-bedroom apartment. This kind of stuff is just where it's going. And then you add in automation, robotics, advanced artificial intelligence, and all this other stuff, and it means less jobs, lower pay, less opportunity, less ability to have a standard of living that's anything remotely close to prior generations, right? I mean, this is not awesome. If you're someone who's living through this, this is not the way things have been here for a long period of time. This is the new normal. And most people then look at, on top of that, the vast degradation of standard of living, they look at where our government is placing its priorities with all of these different machinations we've been talking about, and they're like, this is effed up. Like, why are we sending billions of dollars to Ukraine, billions of dollars to Egypt, to other countries around the world? Why are we giving subsidies to industry? The fossil fuel industry in our country gets $15 billion a year of subsidies to give them incentives to explore. They're already producing at record levels. Why do they need a $15 billion subsidy? That's off limits because the American Petroleum Institute has a very powerful lobby that does the same things that AIPAC does and makes it very difficult for anybody who's fiscally conservative to even bring the issue up, much less create a bill, much less try to get that bill out of committee to change the policy. And this happens all across the board, whether it's pharmaceuticals, medical industry, healthcare industry, Luigi, especially the military industrial complex, the agricultural industry. It goes right on down the line. Telecommunications, social media companies, technology. If you just go down the line and look at most Congress people get contacted by 10, 12, 15 lobbyists a day. And these are the people who provide the intermediary connections to funneling of this money and doing it legally, quote unquote. But, and by the way, one of the ways, just so you know, one of the ways that politicians get benefits from having played this game is that a lobbying firm will put their whole family on their payroll as if they're lobbyists. And so instead of just giving one salary to a previous legislator of, let's say, $2 million a year, they'll employ their whole family for like $6 million a year. This is how these people go from having $2 million when they're in Congress to having $40 million 5 years later, or $100 million, or whatever it is. Not to mention the information that Congress people get as being in this special arena that they can then use to make advantaged investing decisions and trades. I mean, this is it's across the board, folks. It's rotten across the board, and it's really gotten bad. And the people that are benefiting from this right now are doing quite well. And the last thing they want to do is see it change. So if you're somebody in those shoes, the foreign policy is doing quite well for you. If you're someone who's pro-Israeli, the foreign policy is looking just Jim dandy right now, right? You're as happy as can be. You're slapping each other on the back saying, isn't this great? We got this guy coming in. He's doing whatever the hell we want. The other people don't stand a chance, blah, blah, blah. And if you're somebody who is in the industry side of America and you have a lot of shares in these publicly traded companies, you're doing great. I mean, the stock market's doing great. Assets are going up in value. If you're someone who owns assets, you're doing great. If you're someone who owns shares in a bank or you operate a regional bank, the amount of interest that people are paying on credit cards and mortgages is at levels that they haven't seen in decades, and their stocks are flying because of it. But the problem is that most Americans don't share in that benefit. They pay into. They're getting squeezed by the very people who benefit from this. So this is not unusual, and this is where it brings in some other sensitive issues, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but if you study history and you look at how these things come to be this way, and who is involved in the transition from where things were, when things were better for more people, to when they get more difficult for most people. Who are the few people that end up benefiting? I'll leave it to your imagination to think about what particular groups of people might be more involved versus their number of people in society or globally versus the number of people who end up benefiting and having positions of power. I think it's pretty clear and indisputable without getting into details. So this is where we are, folks. Now the question is, what are possibilities? What does the road ahead lead to? I mentioned Alex Karp from Palantir. Why do I bring up Alex Karp? Well, if you don't know, Palantir Technologies is a data security and information management firm that has all sorts of software tools that it develops for different industries. One of which is for domestic surveillance, facial recognition, this kind of stuff. Another which is intelligence gathering and AI-driven targeting systems for military applications. And by the way, Palantir is the firm that, for the Israelis, developed the Lavender AI targeting system that's been used in Gaza and probably now in the West Bank. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it was a predictive analytical tool that would take known information about certain members of what they perceive to be, adversaries, age group, and associates, their cell phone data, their previous movements, their known associates, and also current movement geographically. And they would use that predictive data to decide, based on the hierarchical level of that particular person or persons, what acceptable level of civilian casualties that might accompany their targeting would be permitted to happen in the case of an attack happening, targeting. And in some cases, if there was a high enough level person, the AI system was programmed with inputs that would allow 300, 400, 500 civilians to be an acceptable loss given the high level of the target. And it went down accordingly. If you were a lower or middle level, the numbers shifted, but they were still dramatically higher than what is permitted internationally when it comes to conflict. It's very disproportionate and very civilian casualty laden targeting system in AI. That's Alex Karp. He's the primary shareholder, or the largest shareholder, and the CEO of Palantir Technologies. I'm just going to tell you, he's guess which group Alex Karp is from. So again, I'm not going to get into conspiratorial stuff, but these things tend to follow a pattern, and it's an irrefutable pattern. I wish it weren't the case, because I'd like to have other explanations that easily supply for what is happening, but this is just recurring patterns of behavior that manifest themselves in era after era, society after society. It follows the same playbook, and it's just that everything rhymes. They say that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And so, this is the difficult stuff. So looking at what to do, this stuff is so firmly entrenched. I would argue, to put it in medical terms, this is like stage 4 cancer after like 5 years of being undiagnosed. And you're trying to go into the doctor and try to face and deal with this shit. Like, what can I do, doc? What are my outlook? And it's not great, right? Most of the time when you go into the doctor and you have stage 4 cancer and it's undiagnosed for a period of time, so you couldn't catch it early, the chances of not being taken over by this stuff is very small, right? And it's almost like, and I saw a video on TikTok, I don't know if this is true or not, but it said that one of the things they think that may lead to some cancers are parasites. And I'm not a medical guy. I don't know the studies. I don't know the data. But I'm sure there's some research that might either contradict or affirm that. But if that is the case, it's very similar to how this works. If you know what a parasite does, a parasite finds a suitable host. And a parasite will attach itself to the host externally, like a tick, or internally via like a worm or some other biological form. And then it basically draws its sustenance from the host. And over time, the parasite can grow in size and can become problematic enough that it can start to actually kill off its host. And so, using that as an example, if you think about a society, a functioning economy, a people's, a political system as a host, including its treasury, its military, its resources, everything about it is what it is. That is the phenomenon, that is the host. And then you look at ways to involve yourself in that, to work your way into that host, attach yourself within, and find a way to extract from the host resources to the benefit of the parasite that ends up harming the host as this parasitic process plays out and enlarges itself, now you understand kind of what's going on. And this has been a very similar process in other societies where there's been a parasitic infestation into the way things function. And what happens is that the balance of how things work in society that are normally the benefits of society are relatively well shared amongst what's left after the elites do something. It starts to shift dramatically. More and more resources get siphoned out from the bottom up towards a few at the top. And that has indisputably happened in the United States. I mean, if you look at our history in 1960 and you look at the history of 2025, drastically different society, much bigger society because of population growth and much bigger economy, but the distribution of resources within the host have gone to a smaller set of ever-growing, dare I say, parasitic class that is sucking the life out of and using the resources of the country, the treasury, the military, to its ends to further accomplish its goals at the exclusion of the vast number of people. Now, what happens is usually if once a parasite gets big enough in your body, maybe you can see a ripple in your abdomen and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, we got to do something about this right away. We got to deal with this stuff. And then you do something drastic to rid the body of the parasite because it's becoming super problematic. If it's possible. Sometimes things get so bad, maybe it's around your lungs and your brain, and you can't do anything because you can't take out your lungs and your brain, right? But the idea is, what do you do to deal with a parasite? You can treat it with medication, but in many cases, surgery is required. And so the question is, what means of remedying or changing the broader circumstances in this odd relationship can be brought to bear to fix it or to at least make it better? And the answer is, I'm not totally sure. Now, one of the ways we're allowed to try to fix the problem of what's made its way into our society is through voting, right? Maybe changing the pieces on the puzzle to try to change how the decisions are made and to limit the movement of this particular thing that's gotten in there. This movement of the wealthy class to extract from everybody in this militaristic sort of security thing, this Leviathan, as I call it. However, that's not working. The medication's not having an impact. That's the first set of medicine. The doctor says, let's try this. Doesn't work. Parasite's getting bigger. What do we do next? Well, we have to do something more invasive, something riskier, something potentially less comfortable, more damaging. But do the benefits outweigh the risks of, or you can just try to live your life as is and let the parasite take its course and do the best you can and be sick and destitute until you finally die, right? These are the choices. So as Americans, this is sort of a, trying to make a comparison here. As Americans and others in the West, let me see, I got a little warning about that. I've got to interact with the live. Okay, there we go. So, this is making me slide a puzzle piece, sorry. That good? Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Sometimes if you haven't touched the screen in a while, it gives you a little warning, thinking that you're not near your phone. So the question is, what can be done? Now, I've talked about this a lot before, and it's a very uncomfortable thing to have to look at because there's a vow that's taken by anybody who serves the public. If you're a police officer, uniformed military personnel, public servant, and it kind of goes like this. You raise your right hand, it says, I swear an oath to protect the United States Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's kind of how it goes, some variation of that. So the question is, obviously we know what foreign adversaries are, people that are trying to attack you, people trying to invade you, trying to harm you, whatever. That's a foreign adversary. The question is, what does a domestic enemy look like? It could be somebody who's a serial unaliver, right? That's a domestic person. If they're causing havoc, if they're running around town to town, unaliving citizens, that's obviously a domestic terrorist, right? But the question is, can you categorize the Leviathan? Can you categorize the larger squirming, squiggling thing as a domestic concern? Or is it considered just part of the system and not identifiable as such? And I think the argument could be made, and again, it's subject to interpretation, it's a very subjective thing, but I think the argument could be made pretty cogently that this has reached a point where it has essentially grown into something that prevents the legitimate checks and balances of the Constitution in such a way that it's become pretty much in and of itself. And it's not a specific person or a small group, it's a collection of things. I'll give you an example. And this is Dr. Shiva's explanation. I'm going to steal it from him. It's like a bunch of birds. You ever look at birds outside and they fly in a flock? And sometimes they're flying around as a big group and they twist and turn quickly. And there's not a meeting of the birds at the tree saying, okay, we're going to go here, then there. They just kind of move as a collective group because they have a similar connection, similar interests. And very similarly, the elite, the oligarchy, and the security apparatus that makes up this Leviathan problem, they behave very similar. They have similar interests. And they tend to move and turn in ways that are self-promoting and self-beneficial because they all kind of recognize what works for their group, what doesn't work for their group. They want to maintain the status quo. They want more, less regulation, more opportunities to get return on capital, more favorable tax policies, the way we engage internationally to their benefit, all that stuff. So they don't have to have a meeting. They don't have to have a meeting. They kind of have similar interests and they kind of swarm together. And that's what's happened. The question is, can that, if that sustains itself, where is the organism called the American experiment going to go? Is it going to go smoothly? Is the population going to thrive and benefit? I guess it's possible. But given the inertia that's happening right now, and it's all going in a direction that I think is rather concerning, I think that question has to be asked by many people. People kind of sense something's not right. Things aren't going the right way. Life's getting more expensive. It seems like some of the reasons for why things are going. We had 9/11 and we had the more Patriot Act, a reduction of, sort of an erosion of civil rights. And I know this is a very American-centric conversation. For those of you who are outside the U.S., I apologize for that, but that's where I'm from. And I think everything we're seeing, especially this unique relationship, where our president has proposed that our military and or our resources go to solve a problem for a neighbor who we have this special relationship with, and use our money and power and resources to fix a problem that they're experiencing, I think that's insane. And that's indicative, that's a symptom of the problem. In other words, that's like throwing up because the parasite is harming you. It's a symptom of the existence of this thing that's made its way in and doing all these things. It's like invasion of the body snatchers kind of thing. And I think we have to look at each part of our lived experience now as Americans as symptomatic of this core thing that's come to bear and grown so dramatically, become so problematic. And the question is it reasonable to look at that and call it out for being a domestic enemy because it's so negatively impacting the vast majority of people? I don't know. You're going to have to make that decision. I don't get to make that decision. And then the question is, if that determination does get made, then how does one, listen, if you take an oath to defend the Constitution from enemies foreign and domestic, well, then the oath keepers have to keep to their oath, right? You can't take an oath to the current leader. You don't take an oath to the current Congress. You don't take an oath to a certain industry. You take an oath to the principles of the Republic. And that's where things, I think, have to go. We have to have recognition of that reality. We cannot let people like that guy Farrow that I engaged with earlier think that everything's just hunky-dory, and if we just go to the next election, it's all going to work itself out because that's how our system works. It's how the system is intended to work. That's not how it's working. And some very smart people have figured out ways to supersede and get around the very systems that were meant to provide checks and balances and representation in society. And give them credit. They've done a great job of it. They've reduced the power of labor unions. They've lessened regulation. They've been able to get favorable tax policy. They've been able to control the way the United States functions internationally, the way it projects power on behalf of the oligarchy, the way it's trying to reduce the chances or the likelihood that we have peer competitors coming up in the form of Russia and China. That's what's going on right now. And that battle's playing out. In fact, it started with Ukraine. And that chessboard is being worked pretty feverishly and has been for a long time by those who understand all this. And we're on the other side of it, just working our daily life, trying to get groceries, just go on vacation, whatever it is, and not trying to get too involved in this crap, because who wants to? But the question is, how much longer can we just sit in that space as American citizens and just kind of let all this play out and hope for the best? And I hope it works out for the best. I sincerely do. And I certainly would never want to advocate for things that create problems from the societal level on up. And the other thing to think about is, and again, having smart people, knowing this, if you're somebody who's in the thing, you're as a part of that, if you know what's going on, you're not a dummy, especially policymakers. Well, what do you think is likely to happen once people kind of wake up? once enough people don't believe in the story anymore, but they believe in what's actually in front of them, their own two eyes, so to speak, versus the narrative, well, they're probably not happy about it. And so the question is, what's going to happen as a result of these, waking up, so to speak, these epiphanies that people experience? And some people get there in different times. I've learned about this a hell of a long time ago, and it's just gotten worse and worse. But the question comes down to, what could that lead to? And obviously, if people see that could spur something, then obviously they're going to want to have tools in place to reduce the likelihood of that taking track, getting any footing. And so one of the things I'm looking into right now, which is fascinating to me, is a combination of the militarization of state and local police forces, which has been going on for decades, as well as what are the tools and protocols that are in place right now that are set to be employed or deployed should some of this discontent manifest itself in ways that are become a challenge of some type. And I think that's an interesting thing to think through, because obviously, I think ultimately we would all like to be able to ask nicely and say, hey, folks at the top, these 5 things we've identified aren't too cool. The money in politics, the healthcare system's all bent. We got student debt. We got problems with addiction. We have, this foreign money going outside the country. Would you please change those things? And they'll probably get behind closed doors and start laughing because, it's ridiculous, right? But asking nicely is the first step you're supposed to do. Just like if you wanted a raise and your company's not treating the workers right, and you have 1,000 workers and you're one worker, you go into your boss's office, you say, hey boss, can I get a couple more paid days off? And they're like, who the hell are you? Get the hell out of my office, right? Or can I get $1 an hour raise? They're going to laugh you out. But if all 1,000 people or 900 people did the same thing in an auditorium, or turned a slip into their supervisor saying the same thing, like, we're all together, either let's consider doing some of these things, or we're all going to be walking out the door tomorrow and you can figure it out for yourself, that's a different thing. That's a tactic. That's a tool that can use to bring leverage where individually there's no leverage. But the challenge is, and this is part of what gets done, I have a friend that did this for a living, is you have to organize the people. So if you talk to somebody at the water cooler one day at work and you're like, hey, I talked to the boss, he told me to go to hell. I think asking for $1 an hour raise is not unreasonable given the company's making $10 more per hour in profits. What do you think about that? Like, yeah, that sounds fair. Well, I'll tell you what, did you vote for Trump or did you vote for Biden? Who gives a shit, right? People have to put that stuff aside and focus on the common interest they have. And by the way, this is what's gotten people in big trouble in this country before. Because anybody who's been effective at having that talk, but on a bigger level, has been targeted for bye-bye. And you have to look no further than Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers. And look what he was doing, which is why he became such a threatening person to the establishment, J. Edgar Hoover. And look at somebody like, there are plenty of people you can look to historically that have started doing some of these things. And, MLK and others that are influential. I talk that they have enough traction with the message and the education they're giving people. It's a threat, because that can start the snowball rolling down the hill that could turn into some of this stuff, right? So the question is, publicly speaking, obviously if you have 1 or 2 people that can easily be, sort of dealt with, then the movement of whatever this may become or whatever it would become goes nowhere, because it kind of starts and ends there. But if it's decentralized, instead of firing 1 worker to stop the organization of the union, what if you had, out of the 1,000 employees, if you had 35 or 40 people that just dealt with the 5 or 6 people in their department? What, are you going to fire all them? That's going to cause the same problem as the strike. So that's kind of how it has to be set up. And there also has to be ways like in the picket line, if you do go to a strike, people have to pay their bills, right? They can't just default on your rent payment or your mortgage. You have to buy groceries. You have to take care of the babies and diapers, blah, blah, blah. So they set up a union fund. And that's called mutual aid when it comes to these types of movements. You have ways of kind of backstopping people at the bare minimum so that they can ride it out, so to speak. And then you have to have specific and commonly held demands that are reasonable. So in the case of the corporation, you might say, okay, we want 2 more paid vacation days a year. We want better safety protections with this equipment if we're working in this environment, and we want an extra $1 an hour. Very simple, specific, reasonable outcomes. that are very easy to negotiate with, that everyone's not going to disagree with. Everybody from the company, if you ask them those three, they're like, yeah, that sounds fair. And then somebody says, well, can we get Spanish class for our non-Spanish? Come on, man. We got to put that stuff at a later date. Those things are important or good to have, but they're not critical to everybody. And that's what this would have to be. And so you can pick and choose in your head what some of those things would be. But I think it's pretty clear based on what we've talked about what some of those really keystone issues are. And I think that if something's going to change for the betterment of everybody, it may not happen. Probably won't happen. And some of the tools from the surveillance standpoint, some of the emergent changes, maybe digital currencies, biometric stuff, having everything on our phones, elimination of cash, some of the other restrictions that may be brought to bear with things like Alex Karp is doing. Maybe this stuff won't be easy enough to do. It may be made impossible, even if with the best of intentions for the best outcomes for the most people, not in a way that's trying to do anything problematic. Just say, hey, these are some shifts that should occur so that life can be better for more. They may be impossible to achieve. And I can't predict the future. And as Chris Hedges says, if you know who Chris Hedges is, he's an intellectual speaker, author, who did some work in prisons to help inmates, learn how to read and write and do some cool stuff. He's a nice guy. And he said, hey, it may be too late for all this. The progression of this cancer thing, this Leviathan, this whatever thing has gotten in and done what it's done, that may be too far gone. It may be stage 4.5, and it may just be the way it is. But the question is, if you're somebody with stage 4.5, do you go through any of the treatment, or you just go to hospice, right? And so there may be treatments that might work. Then we may be in the bottom of the ninth inning, and someone may hit a grand slam, right? It can happen. But again, the odds are against it. But it doesn't mean that people shouldn't try. And his point is, you have to be able to tell your kids, at least we tried A or B. We didn't just do nothing. But the problem is, and again, I'll put it this way, the challenges are, and I talked about with somebody very intellectual about this for about an hour yesterday, is that most people are overworked, they're tired, they're stressed out financially, and when they get home from work, having worked a job, 2 jobs, whatever it is, do you think they want to go down to the corner and start talking to people about this stuff? No, they want to have a glass of wine, take a load off, watch Netflix, take a bath, or what, maybe go play fantasy, whatever it is, just whatever gives you an outlet to get away from the stress. And it makes sense. So the challenge is in the face of all of that, how does one go about engaging with their neighbor, their coworker, so to speak, at the water cooler? And even though the coworker is stressed out and doesn't want to lose their job, and they may have some fear around that, how do you present things in a way that makes sense to somebody given the presentation of the bigger picture? And I think that's the challenge ahead. I think a lot of people, and the system is set up to keep a lot of people purposely out of focus, such that they think about it's the person who voted for Trump in the other department, and that's the problem. And the person who voted for Trump in the third department looks back at you in HR and says, that idiot voted for Biden. And I can't work with that person. They're a moron. They want people who have other body parts to be a different gender. And the person who is the other body parts of the gender says, that person wants to lock up families who are coming to the country. I can't work with that person. And so they don't unionize. And then who wins? Management. And management is the Leviathan. Management is the Leviathan. And the media system and the societal education is all geared towards getting compliant, distracted workers who know just enough to do the jobs, but are tired, stressed out, fearful, and not able to organize to push back against the real challenge, which are those 2 or 3 key issues that everybody can have a common interest on. That's the challenge of all this. So I point that out. It's obviously pretty obvious to most of you, I bet, but just to paint a picture around it. And unfortunately, the particular group of people that have wound their way into and sort of intermingled themselves among this elite happen to be the same group of people that support the shit that Trump just talked about. And unfortunately, they're very effective and they're almost ruthless beyond belief in how they go in pursuing their goals, up to and including things like blackmail and financial stuff to try to co-opt people. I mean, I'll give you an example of one person who I think is victimized by this. It may not be President Trump. I have no proof. But I would bet my bottom dollar. Anybody ever heard of Alex Jones? The guy from InfoWars? He went through the lawsuits of Sandy Hook because he said some things about the Sandy Hook shooting. And I believe, hey Sheila, I believe that he was approached by some people because he was in terrible financial situation, just like Trump was. Follows the same, it's always the same scheme. And he was told basically, hey, I'll tell you what, we'll help you out, but here are some boundaries we want to set for you. And if you listen to the content of Alex Jones, go back in the archives, you can find it on YouTube, and you listen to how he addressed certain issues then versus how he addresses them now, totally marked difference. And so again, you just have to be somebody who can kind of read between the lines and see clearly what this stuff is. There's no official statement on the Alex Jones channel that says, hey, so-and-so came and talked to me, gave me some money, so now I got to talk about this shit and not this shit, right? But you want to trust people, in my view, who don't give a fuck about money. I mean, we all need money to some extent. It's like oxygen, right? You got to pay your bills, you got to cover the basics. But anybody who desires money to go with a more lavish lifestyle, who wants possessions and watches and social status, that's all bullshit. And you want somebody to tell you stuff who doesn't care what money somebody offers them, what woman or desirable things they throw in front of you, who has some core principles that aren't going to change no matter what. Those are the people you want to find and listen to because they're not corruptible. And there may be more people that are. I mean, listen, I don't blame anybody if they want to have a fancy lifestyle and they decide to go that route, and a lot of people do. And a lot of the information that flows through our society is because of the desire to fit into the social scene as well as have the nice things of life. And I can understand that attraction, and it's probably a very much more comfortable way to go through your life. You get invited to the cocktail parties, people like you, they don't say bad things about you. But ultimately, truth is one thing you can't buy, and integrity is something you can't buy. And you can't, by the way, the other thing you can't buy is the feeling that you get either helping somebody else or standing up for what's just. There's no amount of money that can buy that. And you can never get it with money. And so as you search, everyone's got to search their heart for what matters to them. We all want to think we're good people no matter what decisions we make. We try to find a way to justify it and stuff like that. But in the end, it's a very simple equation. Would I want what's happening to these other people to happen to me? Would I be okay with that? And if the answer is yes, then you got a good deal because you're willing to endure whatever you're giving. And if the answer is no, then you're on the wrong side of the deal. You're taking advantage, you're exploiting somebody, or you're supporting people who are doing that stuff. And that's really what it comes down to. And I'm not religious, a lot of people are, but I would imagine that if there is a judgment day, these are the exact issues that are going to be focused upon. And the richest person in the room who did all these crazy things to justify their position of power and be able to accumulate all this stuff, that's not going to be a great moment for those folks if that's the way it goes. And the people that weren't looked at as wealthy and were just sort of helping others and trying to stand by principles where try to mitigate the harm and maximize the benefit to people, they're going to have that best time in that. I'm not including myself among them. But I just imagine that's the way we were meant to be. And all of the principles in all of these books, whether it's the Quran or the Bible, maybe the Torah, definitely not the Talmud, speak to these exact qualities. Do unto others they want to do unto you. Don't transgress, don't steal from people. Don't bear false witness, don't be a liar. Don't do all sorts of crazy stuff with other people's spouses. Just stuff that keeps the peace and harmony, like just basic decency, right? And that's what we need to get back to. Our society, this is not some moral condemnation, but our society, basically, some of the core principles that drive the incentives of the society are out of whack with those core principles. And the irony is that the Christian fundamentalists, and I'll probably end with this is ironic to bring it full circle, the Christian fundamentalists, who are supposed to be the most ardent, fervent believers in Christ and Christ-like principles, are the ones who are supporting the mass murder of Palestinians and supporting the ethnic cleansing of 2 million Palestinians so that the United States can create, what is it called? The Dubai, what is the Riviera, a new Riviera on the coast of Gaza. That to me is just indicative of the rot and how far off the reservation people have gotten away from the core principles. They've somehow morphed Jesus into accumulation, prosperity, theft, subjugation, exploitation. It's like, it's all ass backwards, right? So I like to think that, I like the principles that are written and stated. I try to do the best I can to stick with them. I, fall on my face like anybody. But that's where we want to try to aspire to, and we're a far way off right now. So, with that said, everybody, I got to eat some food, by the way. I know we had some guests in the queue. Maybe I'll do a quick guest. Oh, Avi wants to come up. Okay, I'll do a quick, I'll do 10 more minutes with Avi. Avi is someone who's pro-Israeli. I think he owns some real estate, hotels, whatever. Let's bring up Avi. He can tell me how incredibly misguided I am with my thinking.
How are you?
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. What's up?
Good, I know. What about you? I think what you're saying, it's about, you're absolutely right because the Christian fundamentalist, it's meet with the Islam fundamentalist, so it could be a really good match because I tell you why. Because the Islam fundamentalists in the Gaza, they say they're going to do it the 7th of October again and again and again. So you cannot really stop it. Israel don't have the mean to stop it because they are not about a Palestinian state or about resolution for the Palestinian issue. They just say it. They're going to do it again and again and again because they want the Islamic State in the Middle East and whatever the age group charter is talking about. So sometimes you need a fundamentalist to fight against other fundamentalists. So the Christian issue against the Islam, not all the Islamic people, of course, but you're talking about the Islamic Jihad and talking about the age group that they are really, what is in the charter. They said that they have to unalive any Jew that be behind any tree and those BS. So sometimes those extremists meet those extremists. So maybe it's a good meeting. Because Israel cannot fight democratic states. It really cannot win those jihadistic movement. Like Boko Haram, Islamic Jihad, the age group. So maybe some need another extremists. Like the evangelists in America to fight those extremists because they just mean. I'm not talking about the Palestinians, the secular who want Palestinian state, who want to live in peace, who want to build their own river and their own big, nice state, peaceful. I'm talking about those jihadistic people. They say they're going to do it again and again and again. And
Okay, okay, slow down, slow down. Okay, so this is where I think we see things a little differently. So I appreciate you sharing that.
thank you.
Let me put out a different way of seeing it. So rather than seeing it through the lens of religious extremism or fundamentalism, remember that a lot of the violent actions that are pointed to in Europe that are done by Muslims that are referred to as Islamic extremism, whether it be like Boko Haram or Al Qaeda, whatever it may be, those are not being done by Palestinians in those instances. They're being done by Muslims. But what motivates a Palestinian to do something in Palestine? I'm going to mute you for a second. There's a lot of background noise. What motivates a Palestinian? What motivates a Palestinian to do something? In my view, and most people I've ever spoken to who are Palestinian have said the exact same thing. And I've asked this of a lot of pro-Israelis, and what the pro-Israelis say and what they perceive is drastically different than what the Palestinians actually believe. And this is the irony of this whole thing. And this is the number one issue that I think is lost along the way. There's two big parts of it. I'll get back to that. So the number one thing is what motivates Palestinians is not Islamic fundamentalism, nor is it abject hatred of Jews. Now, I know you can point to places like the Charter that said that their goal is to rid the territory of Jews, right? So let's park that for a second. We have to get down to the why of all of this, though. Not the who, but the why. So if you look at the history of what took place, Avi, obviously there were people living in a region in modern history, and there were a group of people from Europe. There were people who were Jewish in the region, but a very small part of the population at the time in 1900 versus the Muslim and Christian population that was there. And a group of Europeans devised an idea for a Jewish homeland. There was massive immigration from Europe and elsewhere into the territory such that the population changed dramatically in a short amount of time. And the idea was to aspire to have a national self-determination and a homeland for the Jewish people with an ethnic Jewish state with a Jewish majority. That was the aspiration. And it came to be. The question we have to ask ourselves is, was it the fact that it was a Jewish state that was the problem? Or was it the fact that another group of people conspired to drastically change the dynamics of the region in perpetuity that would forever cause chaos and stress where many people were adversely affected by said changes? And they didn't agree to the changes, by the way. These changes were put upon them by a third party, arguably the prevailing power after World War One. But the question is, did they or the United States or the financiers have a right to forcibly implement this against the popular will of the people, the vast majority of people that live there? And I think the answer to that, in fairness, from their point of view, is of course they didn't have the right to do that. They did it, but it doesn't mean they had the right to do it. And because of the negative impact, the psychological, the physical, all the impacts that people sustained as a part of that change is something that angered them. And I think that makes sense. That's a normal human response. If somebody comes in and you have to leave your territory, you lose people. Some people leave because they're getting out of the way for the conflict to end, thinking they can come back. Whatever combination of those factors, the bottom line is they ended up in a really horrible situation because of the intentions of the people who really had no right to come in and scheme this up. They just did it. So the anger, what I've heard every Palestinian say to me is that the anger flows from that, what I refer to as the original sin in the region. It's not that Jewish people don't have a right to protect themselves and be free from harm. I think that's a legitimate aspiration. But when it's done on the backs of and harmful to others in ways that were diabolical, scheming, and didn't take into account any negotiation with the people that were there other than here's the deal, take it or leave it. We're taking 56% of the land being 30% of the population. Why are you so obstinate not accepting our gracious deal? We accepted our part of it. I can understand why someone else would say, forget about who it was, that deal sucks, but any deal sucks. I can understand why they would say no to that, but that's not what happened. And ever since then, their resistance flows from the anger that came from those changes, not from the fact that it happened to be Jews who did it or they maintain a certain religion. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I didn't want to go to the history because you're absolutely wrong about everything you say about the history, but I don't want to get to it. I just take 2 points about the history. Usually, the people like you talking about the European Jew, most of the Israelis is not European. Most of the Israelis are Middle Eastern Jews, that ethnic
No, no.
Let me just finish. I don't want, I don't want to.
Stop. I didn't claim the majority of the population was one way or the other. I said that the people who schemed this idea up were European, Ashkenazi, atheist Jews, matriarchal Jews. That's what I said.
I didn't want to talk about the history. It's not true because, but never mind. I don't want, but my focus is, nothing about this, what you're talking about, because my point of view is, I don't talking about the history. I'm talking about the solution. We have the Palestinian Authority. They are secular people. They are fighting also in Jenin. If you know what, you probably don't know what's happened here because you're talking about the Palestinians.
No, I know exactly what's going on.
So let me just finish my point. I didn't interrupt. So the Palestinians have, they are not all the same. You're talking about them like the Palestinians talk to me, the Palestinians tell me. No, the Palestinian Authority, they fight also like the extremists in Jenin, against the Islamic Jihad, against the age group. Most of the Palestinians are good people. And most of the Palestinians want a Palestinian state side by side with Israel. I'm talking about those people, the extremists. The extremists are jihadistic. And you say, oh, nothing about Boko Haram and the Islamic Jihad or whatever. No.
Sorry, guys, I can't entertain this anymore. Let me explain for the audience why that is complete malarkey. Now, he is right in one point in that there are members of the Palestinian Authority that are trying to work in conjunction with the Israelis to go against those who are resisting. I agree with that. That's happening. I think that's shameful, not because I want to see resistance or fighting or terrorism or any of those reasons like that. But you have to go back to what happened politically to understand why that's happening. You're saying because they're reasonable and they're non-Islamists, they're not jihadists. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is about political pragmatism and survival and greed and self-servitude. So listen for a second. In 2006, the Palestinians were encouraged to have free and fair open elections, which they did. And 74% of the body politic voted for Hamas to take power. Why did they do that? Because of their long-standing frustration with the inability of the PLO and then the Palestinian Authority to achieve political outcomes that were favorable towards their path to self-determination and freedom. That's the only reason why Hamas got elected in the first place, because they knew that the writing was on the wall, that if they kept doing the same old under Abu Mazen, that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And they were going to have more land settled, more land taken over, more subjugation by the Israelis, and everything would eventually get extinguished for their goal. So they had to change things up, just like the United States in 2016 voted for Donald Trump over the establishment candidate Hillary Clinton. Very similar in the mindset of the politics. Now, what has since happened that's involved what you just said? To survive, knowing that the population is adamantly opposed to PA policy of this sort of just do the best we can with what we got, for lack of a better way of describing it. The people don't like that. They want to stand up against the injustices they're experiencing. So obviously, Hamas in Gaza is much more aggressive in its stance in not wanting to work in a conciliatory fashion with their occupiers. So they decide to use violent resistance, whereas the PA has taken the course of, well, let's control what we can. Let's work within the Oslo Accords. The Israelis can do what they have to do in Area A, Area C, because we can't control that too much. We don't have the physical might, and it's better just to let it be for what it is and do our best and stay in power, which is why 89 or 91-year-old Abu Mazen has stayed in power. Otherwise, he'd be gone. And so what the Israelis have done essentially is says, we'll help you stay in power. We'll work with you from a security standpoint. You get to maintain power in the PA. Hamas is our sworn enemy. And some of the groups that don't support those policies, they try to fight back in whatever ways they can in places like Jenin, in places like Ramallah, or wherever it may be, Hebron. And there's this battle going right now, a twofold battle. There's the battle of the Palestinians who want to resist within the West Bank against the Israeli occupation, and they're fighting the police forces of their own people who are trying to stop them from unsettling the balance of power, which allows them to stay in power. That's why they're doing it, not because they're moderates or they're not jihadists, as you refer to. There's a legitimate aspiration for self-determination and freedom that the Palestinians maintain, and I believe it's righteous. I don't agree with the tactics sometimes, but to explain it that they're non-jihadist in some way, or they're just better people or more mellow people, more non-radical, is to not understand the political dynamics that I just expressed. And this misperception by the Israeli public and those who support Israel to not understand what drives the behavior and ignoring what really drives their behavior is what prevents peace in the first place. Because it's very simple. This is not complicated. Israel tomorrow morning could say, you know what? We've rethought our position. We're going to withdraw our settlements. We're going to go back to the pre-1967 borders. We're going to allow you to have a capital in East Jerusalem, which we will share. We'll have security to prevent this. We'll allow full recognition of Israel, but you can't attack us, and you have to recognize us and allow us to have the territory that was given to us through the United Nations in 1948. A lot of people wouldn't like that. A lot of people would rather have all the territory back because it was rightfully theirs before it was taken from them. I don't begrudge them for feeling that way, but I think most people now have gone to the place of being politically pragmatic. Even the quote-unquote extremists that you refer to have said publicly, and the H group militants in Lebanon have said publicly, and the Arab League has backed all this up and said, if Israel's willing to do that, we will guarantee their recognition and their security. And we've gotten the agreements of all the parties involved along those lines. And guess what Israel said to that? Go fuck yourself. Go fuck yourself is what they've basically said in no uncertain terms. And what they've done is they've decided that the path ahead for them is going to be one because they have the military presence and they have the quote-unquote upper hand from a strength standpoint, that they're going to try to forcibly submit and control the Palestinian people. Why? Because they can. Because they have the U.S. that has their back politically and militarily and financially, and the U.S. will go and fight other conflicts in the region, like in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, to vanquish Israel's foes to the end of Israel maintaining that control in the region. And that's what we're seeing right now. That's what we're seeing play out. And this recent chapter in Gaza was because normalization was happening with the other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, a very critical supporter, as well as the Syrian government, which has obviously fallen. And the window of opportunity was closing in on the Palestinians. So they made the calculated decision to stir up and to reinitiate the military part of this conflict because it was a necessity given the broader circumstances. I'm not justifying what happened to people on October the 7th by saying that. I'm acknowledging political reality from their perspective. Okay? Now, what has happened since? The Israeli military has tried to go in based on its stated goals to eradicate the H group fighters and to extract its hostages. It's been unsuccessful on the first by a long shot, by the second one partially, because they're still in negotiations to get some of the people back. But it's clear that Israel doesn't have the military capability, at least without causing immense international condemnation, more so than it's already received, to just completely obliterate Gaza to try to kill off all the people and its fighters. So now what they've done is they've leaned on their big brother to try to get the incoming president to do the dirty work for them and to say it's going to happen, to put the financial and political pressure on the neighbors to accept refugees, to forcibly expel the population from the region, which just leaves Israel in a more dominant position vis-a-vis the problems that it had been encountering for the last 17 years as they've been blockading these people in. That's the political reality for anybody who studies this. And if you don't understand what motivates Palestinians, it makes total sense. We can't work with these people. There can't be peace because they just want to kill us and they want to have everything be Muslim, right? Which is a bullshit, complete fabrication and misunderstanding of the conflict. And as long as you lean on that as the rationale, it will never make sense. There could never be peace, right? You can't make peace with somebody who just wants to kill you, no matter what you do. And they point to Gaza, having withdrawn from Gaza in 2005, is the prime example of this, right? But what had not changed yet when Israel pulled its settlements out of Gaza, about 5,200 people, what hadn't changed? There was still a military occupation since 1967 in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So as long as the Palestinian people are not free, regardless of which small subset of their population may be free from certain settlements, they still are going to resist because the broader circumstances of self-determination and freedom have not been acquired or reached. Does that make sense? If you can't understand that, then you don't understand human motivation. Because if you flip the script and everything was the same, except on one side you had a smaller number of Arabs controlling a larger number of Jews, the same shit would play out if everyone's motivated for their interest and behave the same way, right? This is the part that Israelis and pro-Israelis don't understand, because it's a lot easier to say they just hate us because we're the Jews and everybody hates us and we've survived and what happened in the Holocaust, and they start pointing elsewhere. What about Syria? Listen, nobody hates you because you're Jewish. Nobody could give a shit. People don't like you for what you've done to them. And when you come into someone else's land, at least where they've been living for the last 10 or 15 generations, you can say, 3,000 years ago, X, Y, and Z, so therefore whatever we do is justified. Most people would dismiss that and say, what, you out of your fucking mind? But when you come into someone else's territory, you emigrate steadily. You're accepted into the territory. Maybe it's not a perfect marriage, but they're not exterminating you. And you scheme up a plan to take more than half the land, being less than 1/3 of the people. I don't know about you, but if somebody were doing that after they were welcomed in, I might not like them for doing that. And I think that's what happened here. And it makes sense. In addition, 750,000 people's lives were disrupted, uprooted, scattered, many of whom got concentrated in this little enclave called Gaza, this little penalty box, if you will. Some people stayed, but they're still the vast minority. And if you were to ask the 2 million or so, quote unquote, Palestinian Arabs inside of Israel how they really feel, yeah, they have a better lifestyle because they're in a broader, more wealthy economy, and they live in a relatively different political environment that is favorable, but it doesn't get them what they ultimately want, which is to have freedom for their people. They don't really feel like they're really a part of Israeli society because they're not Jews. And they want to have that. Now, do they want to go live in the occupied West Bank and get raided by IDF soldiers? Do they want to go live in Gaza and get shit on 24/7? No. But that doesn't mean they don't want to have the same thing that the people who are living in those circumstances want. And there is a possibility for peace. I don't think it's ever going to happen because I think the obstinance of the Israeli Zionists don't want peace. They say they want it. I think a lot of Israeli civilians want peace, or at least did before October the 7th. I think that's sincere. But the leadership, if you really take the time to understand the motives and the actions of the Israeli leadership of all different types over the decades, they've never really offered anything that they knew would be acceptable to the other side. In all of these so-called sweetheart deals that have supposedly been the Arabs ignoring and never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, all that bullshit, some of the key considerations that the Israeli negotiators knew would not be acceptable to Palestinians, they set forth anyway and then blamed them for saying no. They knew that having a capital of East Jerusalem was an absolute must. They can't abandon their connection to their religious identity in Jerusalem just because you want to take it all for yourself, right? And they knew as a negotiating point that was a non-starter, and yet they put it forth anyway. In fact, Ehud Barak at the Camp David Accords in 2000 said to Clinton, I'm not going to talk to Arafat. I'm going to be sitting up in my hotel room. I'm not going to talk to him about any of the terms of the deal. I'm happy to talk about, what flavor tea we like best. But it was Shlomo Ben-Ami, the foreign minister, who delivered the terms to Arafat, knowing full well they would not be accepted. And what did he say publicly afterwards? He says, I knew they weren't going to accept it. If I was him, I would not have accepted these terms. and yet they get blamed for being obstinate and unreasonable. This is the kind of shit that if you do the work and read the documents and read the history of what actually happened, rather than the slogans and the bullshit narratives, you come to learn. But most people don't want to take the time and effort to read this shit and understand it. I don't blame them. It takes a lot of work. But I learned about this when I was 21 years old. I'm now 57. I've spent countless hours trying to learn more about this because it's fascinating to me. I don't have a stake in the outcome, but I want to know as much as I can to be able to speak to it from a position of knowledge and not from some bullshit narrative that your grandmother and your father told you. And so you just spit it back out because it sounds good and makes you feel better about the bullshit you're doing to other people. And that's unfortunately where it is. Let me see who else is in the guest queue here. Avi, I'm not bringing you back up, brother. In fact, guys, Eric Warsaw has his lives. I think he's probably started already. Maybe he's already well into his guest being there. But there's a special guest on Eric Warsaw's live. She's a director. I think she's also Palestinian. So why don't you go check out his thing? Avi, what you're putting out, dude, people are no longer buying. You can think it. You can believe it. It may be as sincere as can be. But people are seeing through the Israeli narrative, and they're not buying it anymore. And millions and millions and millions of people around the world right now are pissed. Because the things that you believe, that you think justify what your country is doing, people are rejecting wholeheartedly. And I think they should. It comes down to brutalization, exploitation, occupation, and oppression. And you try to couch it in self-defense. And that's bullshit. Okay? I'm going to shut it down, everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here. Any moderators that helped out. It's been fun. This has been a good live, more so than usual. What I'm going to do is I'm going to record this one. And I'm going to put it on my YouTube and my Rumble channels. So if you want to find that, because some people were asking earlier, because I described the entirety of the political system and all the mash, everything that's going on, I kind of summed it up for you today, as I see it. There's a link in my bio. It says Chip Barnes Linktree or Linktree Chip Barnes. If you click on that, it pops up a little list, and on that list is my YouTube channel and my Rumble channel. I may not be able to post this on YouTube. It may get taken down because it does cover a lot of terrain that's, sensitive terrain, but it'll definitely be on my Rumble channel. So for now, everybody, it was fun. I enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you again. Please go to Eric Warsaw's live right now. I'm going to go there myself. Okay.